What motivated my consideration of the project is the interplay between the notions of bureaucratic discretion on the one hand and bureaucratic neutrality on the other. The amount of discretion that we give bureaucrats in policymaking is really driven by this idea that bureaucrats are going to exhibit a degree of neutrality in their professional, in their political, in their administrative decision-making. But there are types of administrative or bureaucratic non-neutrality that really trigger a lot of notions of things that we think are really unfair. And the sort that I'm considering right now, that professional and political decision-making is driven by public officials' own private financial interests. But what makes this particularly interesting from a scholarly perspective and particularly troubling from a normative perspective is the possibility that the professional decision-making by bureaucrats that's supposed to be public policy, broadly construed, broadly implemented, is made in association with the personal investments or private finances of members of the federal government or other levels of government potentially as well. How do bureaucrats' personal finances impact their decision-making? We have this normative idea of bureaucratic neutrality that's informed by the idea that specialization justifies discretion and that bureaucrats are going to be making decisions that are more professional than members of what we in sort of the American politics crowd would think of as the elected branches of government. So my theory contends that bureaucrats themselves, like any other rational economic actor, will seek to maximize their personal financial well-being subject to sorts of constraints. The idea is that if bureaucrats themselves are even partially motivated by their own personal financial interests, we'll see that in their decision-making, particularly to the degree that administrative choices are associated with economic outcomes. I chose to analyze decision-making by members of the National Labor Relations Board and to ask whether the personal financial interests of members of the NLRB are associated with their decision-making in industrial relations disputes. What is the actual mechanism that we see in terms of the decision and what sort of association is there? Members of the federal government, at least in expectation, are subject to the same sort of ethical constraint that would prevent them from hearing a dispute. What I'm doing here is applying my theory of how bureaucrats' personal financial interests might affect their administrative decision-making by considering board members' votes in these disputes that go all the way up to the board from an initial trial. So the decisions, I think pretty clearly, there can be substantial costs. So the hypothesis that flows as an observable implication from the theory of personal financial interests and bureaucratic decision-making that I offered earlier is presented here in terms that are more specific to the types of disputes that occur before the labor boards. What I call the alternative, the precedent creation hypothesis, has the direction, the expectation going the other way, which is that the greater the extent to which a member is invested in an economic sector, the greater the likelihood that they'll vote in favor of disputants from that sector. What we see is at least cautious confirmation of the hypothesis having to do with competitor punishment, which suggests that the greater a member on the board is invested in an economic sector, which has a firm subject to a dispute, the less likely that that member will vote for the management disputant. So it seems that personal finances and investments among members of the administration and the bureaucracy are driving their decision-making. So in terms of future work, I'm going to consider the different types of remedies that are available before the board, and also to look at variation in design across the bureaucracy and how certain types of organization and organizational characteristics might either enable or constrain the sort of behavior that we see in the evidence that I presented here from the Labor Board in other sorts of regulatory and adjudicative environments.